Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. So my name is Michael Dravniaks. I work at Coast Digital. I'm going to be talking about user testing with biometrics. So what I'm going to be covering in this webinar is testing as part of a UX process. So talking about what UX really means to us and where kind of testing fits in, how and why we test. So looking at user behavior, traditional methods of testing before kind of biometrics came along, and some of the drawbacks around those traditional methods, and then how we can take user testing further with biometrics. And I'll look at some of the equipment that we can use, what we can learn from biometric testing, and give you some examples as well. So plenty to talk about. I'll get started shortly. I just want to give a quick introduction to Coast Digital ourselves. So we are a full-service digital agency that takes pride in creating success stories. We're really driven by understanding your challenge. So we like to unpack a brief, really get under the skin of what's required, and we can do that in a number of ways, and testing is one of them. And really, we're fanatical about data and inspired by user insight. So we're real geeks when it comes to numbers. We love sitting in front of analytics and telling a story with numbers, and then really delivering insight through the data that we can collect, whether that's from, say, just Google Analytics or other heat mapping tools that we can use, and delivering insight from user research, stakeholder insight, etc. Really kind of getting underneath a brief and unpacking it with kind of all the tools that we have at our disposal. So just a bit about us as an agency. So we work around a foundation of ROI. It's really important to us. It's always been a kind of foundation of the work that we've done. And we take a user-centered design approach. So I'll talk about this a bit more later, but users are really at the heart of what we do, everything that we do, and we build a really solid foundation of research underneath kind of all of the work that we deliver, whether it's UX, web design and build, or online marketing. We've been going for 17 years. We've got offices in London and Colchester, and we're currently 46 people strong, but we're always growing, always expanding, which has taken on another office. So yeah, we're on the rise. I've got some client logos here, classic client logos. These are some projects that I've worked on, some client projects that I've worked on personally as part of like a UX process, and these projects have all included user testing along the way. So let's start with a bit about testing and what UX means to us and what our UX process really looks like. So if you Google UX and look at images, you'll see some things like this, diagrams like this, and like this one. So it's quite complex and seemingly quite a lot involved in user experience. And that's really because user experience, UX, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people depending on who you ask. It's more of an umbrella term, and it covers things like interaction design, information architecture, visual design, journey mapping, research. There's so much to it that it can mean lots of different things to lots of different people, lots of different agencies, depending on who you ask. But what it really means to us is that it gives us, it's a series of tools and techniques that give us insight that are completely scalable and flexible depending on the project. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to user experience. We can kind of pick and choose the tools and techniques that we need to deliver the insight that's really going to help us on the project, depending on who the client is, who the users are, and what the end result needs to be. But the real key is that users are at the heart of any UX process. And that's the most important thing. Some people believe that just making wireframes is UX, or doing visual design and thinking about how someone will use a website is UX. But if you're not thinking about users and really kind of understanding them through data, through insight, through research techniques, and through, most importantly, testing, then that's not really truly UX, or it's not to us anyway. UX to us is designing with users at the heart. Now, designing for users is fantastic, but if you only listen to users and you only design with their needs in mind and you ignore your business goals, then really you're going to build something that your users like, but may not actually create conversions or make money for you and your business. So a good UX process delivers conversions. So it's that overlap between user needs and business needs that UX really shines. So while we go into a lot of effort to understand user goals, user requirements, and user behavior, we do the same within a business as well. So we'll speak to key stakeholders from around a business, managers, people who have to operate the back end of a website or work with software or offer support to customers every day, understand their requirements and their needs, and then match those two things together, the user requirements and the business requirements. So I want to show you what a typical top level view of a UX process looks like for us. So we start with an initiate phase, which is where we plan the team structure. We'll come up with a project plan. We'll assess the goals of a project. We'll unpack a brief. We'll meet the client that we're working with and get kind of like an understanding, a shared understanding of the way forward, and kind of create the research tactics or the UX tactics that are going to help us to deliver the insights that we need for the project. The second phase is moving on to the research phase itself. So we'll look at data, we'll look at user insight and understand objectives. And there's so many ways that we can do this through surveys, interviews, telephone interviews, face-to-face interviews, polls on websites, looking at heat maps and running sort of different tools underneath websites that will deliver data to us. There's a world of kind of insight to be gathered, and again, like I said, in the initiate phase, we'll plan our research tactics and then we'll execute them in this research phase. After that, we have what we refer to as a UX design phase. This is typically where we take the outputs from that understanding in the research phase and start putting them into visual assets, where a website or an app or a piece of research will really start to take shape and start looking and feeling like a set of deliverables that will be able to help a designer and a developer to kind of build or deliver the final asset. So examples here are wireframes that a lot of people are very familiar with. They're almost synonymous with UX design. So wireframes, sitemaps, user journey maps, interaction design, kind of plans, blueprints, the kind of visual assets. Personas is another key one. The kind of visual assets that will help a designer and a developer later on, because the next step is naturally visual design. So a visual design is where branding, identity, copy kind of come into play here, to add the visual layer on top of some of the assets like a wireframe. And then we move on to development, where we start the build, the coding, and testing before launch. At this point, we are going to be pretty sure that what we're delivering is what the users need and what the business needs, because we've gone through this process of research, UX design, before the visual design and development. A long time ago, some agencies used to start with the visual design phase. There was no research behind a project, and we just sort of start designing what a page would look like and then build it and then launch it and see what happens, which is really not a very efficient way to build a website. So while this process from end to end may take a little bit longer than that old style of process where you just start building something and seeing how it works, this de-risks a project, because the research that goes into it and that understanding that goes into the process really means that it delivers the insights that make you really sure that what you're going to be launching is in keeping with what the users want and what your business needs. Now, I wanted to just drill into a bit of detail around each of these stages and show you where testing fits in. So if we look at our initiate phase, we've got some project planning and a kickoff workshop, which is kind of fairly standard stuff at the start of a project. Then we go into the research, so data review, stakeholder engagement, competitor review, user insight comes next. And this is where we might start to introduce some testing. So on this diagram here at the bottom of that hexagon, we've got biometric testing, which might be the first instance of testing in this process. What we can do is test if we're redesigning a website or creating an asset like a new version of an app or a website or a piece of marketing material. What we can do is learn by testing the old version of it, the previous iteration of it, putting it in the hands of users and seeing how they interact with it. So a brief might kind of tell us what the company or the client thinks is wrong with their asset and why they need a new one, but this will really give us even more insight. So watching someone use the old website or the old app, seeing where the problems are, seeing where the difficulties are, and being able to kind of measure the positive and the negative impact there can really give us deep understanding of what to do in the later stages of a build project. So as we move on past the research phase and into the UX design phase, we stop here at prototype production. So I mentioned wireframes are a key part of UX design, but what we can do is use tools to link several wireframes together and create like a clickable prototype that may lack the branding and the visuals of a finished website, but for all intents and purposes can be tested with because pages can be linked together. We can kind of use some smoke and mirrors to create the feeling of functionality, and we can test with a set of wireframes to see how people navigate through a site, how they digest the information on a site, how they go about certain user journeys, whether they can use the checkout, whether they can complete this goal or use this piece of functionality early on. And that's really key because in this wireframing stage of the project, it's really easy to make changes and we can make changes very, very quickly based on feedback in testing sessions. It's really quite an efficient way to make changes. In contrast, if you were to make those kinds of changes after a website had launched, and you're making those changes in code, it's far more inefficient and far more expensive to make those changes while a website is live. Doing it before a website has even been visually designed is far quicker and far less painless or more painless. So yeah, we have a testing and feedback loop here after a prototype production. And then we can make changes before we move on to visual design. So at this stage, we're going to be really sure that our user journeys are tight, our wireframes are performing well, and then we can apply kind of the visual design and branding. At this stage, we can do another testing loop. So we can test with visuals and branding, and we can get more of an emotional response from users because they're seeing imagery, colors, design, branding, and identity, and we can get different type of emotional feedback at this point. And again, act upon that feedback because there's no code involved yet. It's just sort of visual design phase. So working in Sketch, InVision or Photoshop, and again, making changes quickly before we move on to build, which comes last. At this stage, like I mentioned before, we've gone through potentially 3 rounds of testing and feedback. So we're going to be pretty sure that what we're launching is going to be fit for purpose and going to perform very, very well before it goes out into the wild. So that's a quick look at our traditional UX design and build process and where testing fits in. Now the types, I kind of touched on this already, the types of testing that we would do here and the types of assets that we would test with are kind of really important. So between a research phase and a design phase, we may do low fidelity prototypes, so wireframes, for example. Between a design phase and a development phase, we might do high fidelity prototypes, so using visuals and branding. And then we'll do some kind of user acceptance testing before launch. But this is where testing fits into our kind of design process and the different types of assets we might test with. So that's an overview of kind of our process and where testing fits in. But it's really it's really key to understand how and why we test. So we need to run tests during a project to understand the following. Is our website achieving what we set out? Is it meeting the goals of the project? Is it meeting the needs of the users that we identified in the research phase? Can users complete the tasks? And actually, how do they go about completing those tasks? So I've worked on so many projects where I've kind of mapped out a user journey and I've thought this is really easy. You're going to go from here to here to here, and it's simple. And then I do some testing with it, put it in the hands of a user, and they will click off to another page that I never thought they would do. And they go about completing this task in a completely different way to how I imagined. So understanding the different ways that users see things and how they may naturally go about something compared to how you thought they would go about completing a task is really, really important to understand as early on as possible. The results of user testing will invariably lead to changes. So again, I've mentioned this a few times already, but making those changes early and often is really important. Making them while it's easy is absolutely key, because websites can be very, very expensive to make. So you want to minimize the risk, like I've said a few times. When you're launching, you want to be sure that you're launching the right thing and not kind of discovering that things need to be drastically changed post-launch, because it's just going to, your costs are really going to balloon at that point. So before I move on to talking about biometric testing in detail, I want to talk about how we traditionally test. So before biometrics came along. And the main way was through what we call observational testing. So observational testing is where we would sit alongside or in a lab watching someone complete tasks on a website or an app. So we'd set them tasks, set them goals, and then we'd observe them. We would record the sessions either through cameras or by kind of recording their screen. We might take notes on what they do, on the things that they say, on the areas of the pages that they were clicking on. We'll likely kind of conduct an interview with them afterwards, ask them how they felt about it, what was difficult, what they liked, what they disliked. And sometimes we'll get them to fill in a questionnaire to give us some statistical data afterwards. And this works fairly well, but there are kind of a few drawbacks. So the first one is that you have to manually aggregate all of your findings. So if you've got quite a lot of tests that you've run, the number of different users, you've got notes and you've got these recorded sessions, it can take quite a long time to type up those notes, look for the overlaps in findings and kind of deliver the insight from there. It takes a really long time to watch all of those tests back potentially, and generally is a very manual process. You're also really reliant on the user being articulate, and that's not always the case. So I've run so many tests where I've gone into, say, a shop to test an e-commerce solution with a user, or I've been pitched up in a cafe and had people come and test a website alongside me. And you don't always get people who can really articulate how they feel about something, even though they may be using websites all the time daily like most of us do, but they're not necessarily used to helping you to understand what's right or wrong about a website, and they're not used to being a part of a test. So you're very, very reliant on people being articulate about how they feel. And quite often that means they can only articulate strong emotions. So if something's really bad, they're able to tell you. But if something could be slightly better, you may not pick up on that because they haven't said anything about it, or when you ask them, they didn't mention it. So micro expressions, micro emotions aren't really picked up on. It's only the really good stuff and the really bad stuff that you uncover. The stuff in the middle, you don't necessarily get a sense of. And you're also very, very reliant on the user giving you accurate information. You may sort of assume that someone is going to tell the truth during a website test, and they may not intentionally lie to you. But I've had I ran a test with some wireframes once, so they were just black and white boxes, no design or visual identity to the prototype that I was testing. And one of the first things the person said to me was like, "I really like the design of this page." Um, which is not malicious, but at that point I sort of questioned the accuracy of the rest of the test and the rest of the insight that they kind of gave me. So there's a few kind of drawbacks to traditional observational testing. So how can we take this further? Well, the way that we do it at Coast is through biometric testing. So I'm going to talk about what that is, the equipment that we use, and what we can learn from it, and I'll show you an example at the end. So looking at what biometrics really means, if we kind of really pull it apart, it's the technical term for body measurements and calculations. Now, biometrics aren't necessarily that new, and a lot of us use them every day already. So if you unlock your phone with your fingerprint, that's an example of using biometrics. Some newer phones you can unlock with facial recognition, again, using the front camera. This is an example of biometric technology being used. Most people seem to have one of these in their house these days. I have two. This is another example of biometrics at play. So you control this device with your voice. And I think actually you can set it up so that your Echo will only respond to your voice, or the voices that you've assigned to it. So a stranger can't walk in and start telling it to change the song or do something different. So it can respond to commands, but it can respond to particular voices as well, which is really quite a fantastic example of biometrics. And lastly, I don't think these are around anymore. This is the sensor for the Xbox 360 and maybe the Xbox One as well. The Xbox Connect. It's not around anymore, but this was a fantastic example of biometrics as well. So the way that it worked was it kind of mapped a skeleton within your body, and then it would recognize where you're moving your hands, your feet, your torso, and your head in order to interact with you, so you could play a game. So this is a really fantastic example of biometrics, because it's mapping your entire body rather than just kind of like your fingerprint, your face or your voice. So we use biometric technology in 3 ways for UX testing. The technology that we have includes eye tracking, galvanic skin response, which is it's a way to measure the sweat in someone's fingers and also their pulse or their heart rate, and facial recognition, so tracking expressions on someone's face to give us feedback about how they feel or the emotions that they're kind of displaying. So 3 ways that we use biometrics: eye tracking, skin response, and facial recognition. So I'll look at each of these individually now. So the first is eye tracking, and we do that through this Tobii sensor. So what it does is it can sit below either a desktop screen, or in this case here, you can see on the right, it sits below a mobile and tablet testing rig. And what it does is it shines an infrared light into the test participant's eyes, and then after a little configuration setup, that light will be shined back onto a screen, and it can kind of measure where you're looking. So when we're using the dashboard and the test is running, we can see little dots moving around the screen to see in real time where someone is looking on the screen. Traditionally, we used to handle this kind of thing with looking at where someone's cursor was on a screen. And there was always an assumption that where someone is moving their mouse on the screen is typically where they're looking. But we've seen, since we've used eye tracking, during testing sessions that actually this is rarely the case. People look somewhere first, and if it becomes an area of interest to them, then they will move their mouse there. So where they're moving their mouse and where they're looking are not always the same. And as I mentioned, this works for mobile, tablet, and desktop setups. So we can test with mobile apps, mobile websites, and also, on a big screen. So eye tracking tells us a few things. It tells us, firstly, which elements attract immediate attention. So if we're testing a digital asset or website, for example, where are people looking first? Which element of the homepage or an inner page attracts the most attention? It also tells us which elements attract above average attention. So where do people look the most? And if it also tells us which elements are being looked at the least, so which are being ignored or overlooked. So if we have a banner, a button, or a part of a homepage that we want people to look at, and we can see through eye tracking that they're just not seeing it, then we know we might need to change the design or the position of it on that particular page. The other really, really good thing that eye tracking gives us is the order in which elements are noticed. So almost a priority list or a hierarchy of interest here. So we can see the order in which people are looking at things on the page, and it actually gives us numbers. So I've got a little video here which kind of gives us an example of some eye tracking. So in this test, we asked somebody to find the library on this university map. And so you can see the cursor moving around the screen here. But you can also see this orange and yellow circle on the screen too, which is the eye tracking. So you can see where the test subject is looking. And you can see that where they're looking and where they're moving their mouse cursor isn't always the same place. You can kind of see the path of their eyes as well as they move around. You can kind of see this trail behind, so you can see roughly the order in which they've looked at things. So it's quite a basic example of eye tracking here, but just kind of gives you a feel for really what that looks like and how the technology works. So after we've run an eye tracking test, we get some of these kinds of outputs. So you can see on the right of the screen here is a heat map. So where the red area is on the left and the navigation, that's the hottest area. So that's where people looked the most, and where we have the kind of denser green areas that eventually kind of go to these lighter, softer green areas. They're the cooler areas where people kind of look at a little bit less. So we can see here in this example down the left, there's a lot of heat around that sub navigation. There's some heat around the top of the screen, the primary navigation, and then in this right column, and a fair bit of interest around these useful links at the bottom as well. So yeah, heat map is a fantastic asset that we get from an eye tracking test, but we also get what's called gaze points. So these are areas where people stop to focus on when they're looking around, and fixation points as well. So these are areas where people have kind of focused their attention. The next one is areas of interest. So what we can do in the software before a test is actually kind of draw a box around any kind of section of a website or a digital asset and kind of say, this is an area of interest and we want to get measurements and data around this particular area of interest. So on the right here, I've got an example of a link that says our libraries. And we've defined that as an area of interest. So how many people are going to look at this link? How long are they going to spend there? So once we've done that, we kind of get this data in this yellow box here that says TTFF. So that's time to first fixation. So we'll get a reading of how long it took a test subject to notice that particular area of interest. We'll also get the time spent looking at that area of interest, and then the ratio, which is the number of test subjects who actually did look at that particular area of interest. So our example here and this libraries link, only one test subject out of the 6 looked at it. They only looked at it for 0.3 seconds, and it took them 38.2 seconds to notice that particular area of interest. So in this test, we were asking somebody to find the university libraries, and I think we can sort of say that it was difficult to find based on these kind of statistics that we're seeing. So moving on from eye tracking, the next way that the next piece of technology that we use in biometric testing is galvanic skin response. So this is a shimmer sensor that's attached to the test subject's wrist, and there's some sensors that kind of are strapped onto their fingers, and it gives us a reading of a few things. So the first thing is their pulse, their heart rate. So we can see different we can see changes in heart rate, which for testing websites and apps, you don't typically get much change there. But if you were testing, say, a sequencer scene in a movie or a particular section of a video game where there was a shock or a scary part of a movie, that might come into play a bit more. But what we really use this for at Coast is for the skin response sensors. So whether you know it or not, your levels of sweat in your fingers change when you have even a slight emotional response to something. So it could be that you run into difficulty in a checkout, maybe that you strongly like or dislike an image on a page, and that kind of emotional response does trigger a change in the sweat that you have in your fingers, even at a really, really kind of tiny level. So if you're watching a video of someone skating on a roof here, you might have like a really, really strong response. But like I said, if you're going through a checkout process and there's a bug in the checkout or something is taking a long time, you might have a really small response to that. So overall, we're measuring arousal here, and we don't know whether it's a positive or negative response that you've had to a particular element on a page, but we know that there is a response. So the kinds of things that this is really useful for, like I mentioned, is images, videos, events, and actually, so it's your hands and your feet both sweat when you have an emotional response to something, but we're just measuring the emotional response through your hands. The key thing is that this tells us real truth about people's reactions to things, because you cannot consciously control the level of sweat in your hands. It's something that your body does, whether you can, whether you want to or not. The data that we get back here in these graphs kind of just tells us that there was a response to something, but really this level of response is useful or powerful when it's combined with other biometric testing like pieces of data, which the main one is the facial expression analysis, which is our third type of technology that we use. So the facial expression analysis happens through this camera that we have on top of the screen here. It can also be used again in a mobile or a tablet setup, as you can see on the picture on the right here. So it sits at the top of this rig here. And actually this is just a webcam. The power comes from the software and the processing that happens with the data that webcam is sending to the iMotion software that we use. So you can see on the left of the screen here, the software is plotting various points around someone's face, and it uses the changes in those points to detect different emotions. And as I mentioned, the intensity of those emotions will be coupled with the skin response sensor as well, so we can kind of tell the the strength of the emotions that are received. So we can measure 7 different emotions. So the first one is happiness, and then there's sadness, contempt, surprise, fear, disgust, and anger. Now, hopefully no one will express too much contempt when they're using your website, but like I said, when combined with the skin response sensor, we can pick up even just small signals of contempt or disgust, etc. So when we think back to the traditional observational testing and what I said about the drawbacks, is that we only really get the strong responses when someone has a really strong positive or negative reaction that they articulate to us. But the skin response sensor and the facial recognition software will pick up really small spikes of sadness or surprise that a user may not even really realize that they're having. So you can see at the bottom left here, this is how kind of surprise would be measured. So a slight raise of the inner brow, a raise of the eyelid, and a slight dropping of the mouth or the jaw. That's kind of how, say, a surprise emotion is kind of defined by the software. And on the right here is the kind of data that we get back. So towards the bottom of that graph, we have our seven emotional responses. They're all different colors. And they're scored between 0 and 100. So how strongly the face of the test subject changed to kind of match that particular emotion. So like I said before, we understand kind of the emotion that's on display through someone's face, but we really can track the intensity of that when we combine it with the skin response sensor. So when we put all of those 3 pieces of technology together, the eye tracking, the skin response, and the facial emotional recognition, we get the output that looks a little bit like this. So I'm just going to play a video example. So again, this is our test subject trying to find the library at the university. And I'll play it and you can see kind of the outputs that we get. So in the bottom here, we can see the emotional responses. So we have some engagement, some surprise, some anger coming up. We can see the test subject's face in the top left and we can hear them talking. We can see the plots on their face, which are how the facial recognition software is plotting their emotions. On the right, we can see the eye tracking, so we can see where the test subject's eyes are moving around the screen, so we can see what they're looking at. And we can also see their mouse cursor as well. So that gives us quite a lot of data to kind of really dig into. I said one of the drawbacks to traditional observational testing is there's a lot of manual aggregation that needs to happen. But the really good thing about the iMotion software that we use for biometric testing is it will compile all of that data together to really give us reports on what's happening with a series of tests. So we don't have to go back and watch these individual tests and then kind of manually put those findings together. The software does a lot of the heavy lifting and processing around emotions, areas of interest, time that it took for someone to notice objects on a screen, the order in which they noticed them, etc. All of the stuff I described is kind of is automatically aggregated, into these reports that we can then dive into in a lot more detail if we want. So just to kind of wrap up on this, one of the biggest drawbacks to user testing, one of the biggest barriers to user testing, and in particular lab testing, has been getting hold of the testing equipment and accessing the facilities. So we have a lab at our Colchester office with all of the biometric testing facilities kind of in one place. And we can test for a lot of different types of content as well. So I've talked about testing websites and apps and kind of marketing materials, but we can also test for TV shows, movies, console games, anything on a television. So the sensors can fit to any kind of size screen. So there's quite a lot of potential with this kind of technology. Um, but just to kind of overcome that barrier of having to go to a lab and hire it, our tech is completely portable. So we can pack it up into a couple of suitcases and we can travel with it. We can come to an office or a cafe. Say if we're testing e-commerce or some kind of back ordering system, we can go to a shopping center. We can set up a lab anywhere really. So these photos I've put on the screen here, the first three from left to right are the lab that we have here at Coast Digital. And then the last photo on the right with the chap with the denim jacket is an example of when I took the equipment out to the University of Essex and we did some testing on the university website with some students that came in. So completely portable, really flexible, and really almost unlimited potential of what you can test. Any kind of visual stimulus that you can put on a screen can be tested, and we can track the emotional responses. We can look at where people are looking and how they truly feel about it. So that's the end of the webinar about biometric testing. I hope you found it really interesting. If you want to know more, there's a lot more that we can talk about here, really diving into the detail of what we can do with it. If you want to know more, or you think it might be really useful for a project that you have or a brief that you're putting together, please do get in touch. We'd love to speak to you and find out how we can help. I've put some contact details on the screen here. So for Victoria Baker, she's the best person to speak to. She can answer any of the questions that you have, and hopefully you found that really useful, and we'll speak to you soon. Now, I've got some time for questions. I'm just going to see if there's any come through here. If you do have any questions at this point, please feel free to type them in the box, and I'll get to those. I've just got a couple here that have come through first. Okay, so the first question that we've got here is a classic one. So how many people do you need to test with? So this is a question we get asked a lot all the time. And really the answer is it depends on the nature of the asset that you're testing, how detailed it is, and really what you want to discover. So when we run a test, we will first of all kind of define the outcomes that we want to discover, the things that we need to discover from the test, and we build the test around that. So we kind of work backwards from what you want to know. So if you are testing, just say, a user journey on a website or a piece of functionality in an app, we typically say that a minimum of five tests would kind of give you 80% of what you need to know. Obviously, the more people you test with, the better, but a minimum of 5 tests, I would say. If you want to test more emotional responses to something, so say if you were experimenting with using different images on a homepage or different scenes in a video or an advert that you wanted to kind of use for marketing online, then you probably want to do a few more, so more like 20, 30 tests. Really, it depends on kind of the scale of or the data that you want to get from it, but I would say a minimum of 5 tests, really. Okay, so another question has come in. So how do you find the people to test with? Again, this is a classic question, and the answer is really quite simple. We go to where those people are. So if you have customer mailing lists, we can invite people to test that way. If you have a survey, so a survey is a really good way to recruit people for testing. So at the end of a survey, we can send a questionnaire, ask a set of questions, and then say, if you'd like to help us even more with a test, please leave your email address or your contact details and we'll be in touch. The other really key thing about recruiting people for tests is to use incentives. So we typically give people £10 Amazon vouchers or a gift card of some kind for completing a test, and we find that really helps to recruit people for tests. Okay, so one more question that we've had come through here so is testing only applicable to UX and design, or does it have broader applications for marketing? Yeah, so I kind of touched on this in the webinar. Really, I mean, you can use it for any kind of asset, really. So I mean, I've talked about it in as part of our UX process, and testing is so like core to UX. Understanding user needs and behaviors and really testing your assets to make sure that you're building the right thing before you launch is critical as part of a user-centered design process. But really, you can use it for any kind of visual. So I mentioned like video games are a really interesting use of biometrics to see how people feel about particular challenges on a level, or even how they feel about a loading screen, for example, or how much of emotional response they might get to a particular reward or bonus or that kind of thing. I think video games are a really, really interesting application for biometric testing, but marketing as well. So if you're putting particular banner ads out there, how people feel about the visuals in a banner, whether they're kind of connecting visually with a person's face on a banner or in a video. So if you're producing marketing videos or some kind of interactive media for a campaign, what's people's emotional response to that? Are they having a negative response to the video that you've put out there that you actually want to garner a really strong positive response from? You're just understanding how people feel about your visuals, whether it's for a website, app, movie, marketing material, banner, video. You can test anything that you kind of put in front of somebody. Okay, so time for one more question we've come through here. So what is the future of this technology, in your opinion? Is it likely to expand? Is there emerging tech which can be utilized? Yeah, so this is a great question. I think there is a real future for this kind of technology, and we've started to see some expansion on it already. So another piece of technology that is kind of in its early stages right now is using glasses or kind of wearable tech to measure how people respond to things in more in different environments. So I've spoken about biometrics within kind of a lab setup, but there are wearables, say glasses or goggles that look like just normal glasses that you can put on people, and you can watch them as they kind of navigate around a shop or a library, or just walking around looking at various signs. So shopping centers are a really good one because you can see how people notice different items on a shelf, whether they look at branding, whether they're looking at above the line advertising. That's a really exciting kind of prospect for biometric testing. Another one is how it's going to be built into phones in the future. So Google have recently put out a patent for now I don't know how they're going to do this exactly, but using the camera on your phone to look at your visual response to things that Google serves up. So whether it's an app or banners or search results, for example. I'm not sure the exact way that they would use this technology, but they've had a patent accepted for kind of using biometrics through an Android phone to see how people are kind of engaging with their products, which I think is really exciting. But whenever people are involved, there's so much data around a person, and their expressions and their feedback that anyone can kind of emit from using their body, that the possibilities are almost endless when you start introducing wearables and the Internet of Things, and when everything's connected in your house, seeing how people interact with technology and be able to kind of pull data from that almost offers like unlimited potential, really, where people and technology are involved. That's a good question. So we've kind of run out of time now. If you have any more questions, you can email them to the address on the screen there. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll get back to you. Otherwise, I hope you found this webinar really interesting. And I'm interested to see kind of what you guys can come back with and what we can test and what we can learn by working together. Thanks very much.